Thank you for taking a few minutes to come and hear this talk. Today, I just want to scratch the surface a little bit um, about an interest of mine, and that is the story of Lizzie Borden, who probably most of you know, but if you don't, was a young woman accused of murdering her father and her stepmother in 1892. So today I want to first focus on a few of the facts of what actually happened in that case, and then shift over briefly to talking about how the case was first framed and articulated and made into a story by newspaper reporters, and how it has continued to live on in all sorts of different formats, from fiction to rock opera over the years. So, first of all, who was Lizzie Borden? She was in 1892 a 32-year-old single woman who lived with her family in Fall River, Massachusetts. She lived with her father and stepmother, as well as her older unmarried sister, Emma. Emma and Lizzie at the time were what the language would have called old maids or spinsters. Or if you're looking at newspaper coverage of the time, they often refer to Lizzie as a girl, even though obviously she was a grown woman. Um, because she was an unmarried woman of a particular social class, she didn't have many options in life. She certainly was not going to work. She spent most of her time with charitable organizations, with working with her church. Um, but again, this kind of unmarried, aging woman was seen by many people at the time as someone to be pitied, but also, as we'll talk about a little later, unmarried women of a certain age were coming to be seen as aberrant, as odd in some way. And so that's kind of the social climate into which Lizzie Borden found herself in 1892. This is Andrew and Abby Borden. Andrew was a self made man. He had built his fortunes up first as an undertaker and then as a property developer. He had a lot of money and he didn't like to spend any of it. Um, Lizzie and Emma knew their father was wealthy. He gave them an allowance, it was very generous, but because they were essentially forced to live with him, they wanted more. They begged him to move to a more desirable part of town. He refused. Uh, he also had introduced some real conflict into the family because he had gifted some land to his wife's family. So Lizzie and Emma's mother had died when Lizzie was little, and Andrew had married Abby a few years later. Abby had essentially raised Lizzie. And that relationship seemed quite amicable until just a few years before the murders occurred. Lizzie had always referred to Abby as mother and treated her with respect and kindness. After Andrew had given that money over, though, to Abby's family, Lizzie and Emma both started referring to her as Mrs. Borden. And they were absolutely insistent that that is the only thing that they would call her. It caused a great rift in the family. And you can imagine everyone living together in a rather cramped house with that kind of tension brewing around money. It wasn't a pretty thing. This is the house that the Bordens lived on. It's still standing today. It's now a bed and breakfast, believe it or not. And for a family of the time that had the kind of wealth that Borden had, this would have been a rather unusual place to live. Now, from the outside, it looks quite grand, quite nice, but Even by 1892 standards, this was not fashionable. The house was in a part of town that was much more working class. It was right on one of the busiest streets in town and just a couple of blocks away from downtown area. This was not the place the Borden sisters really felt like they wanted to be at. And this house, even though it looks large from the outside, it's actually quite cramped inside. The rooms are rather small, rather claustrophobic. It has almost an oppressive feel to it, especially when you consider this is Victorian area where houses are filled with all sorts of tchotchkes. There's not a lot of space to move around, especially if you're talking about four grown adults. The house was also very unfashionable in terms of modern conveniences. Modern plumbing was a thing in most houses by 1892, most nicer houses. The Bordens only had a pump in the basement of their house, cold water tap. Borden also refused to put in gas lines, so there was no gas lighting for the house. He considered things like that frivolous and was just unwilling to modernize the house. If you look at the floor plan of this house, you can also see a little bit about how the house was not really well suited for a family. You can see kind of the scale of the house by looking at this floor plan here, but you can also see something rather unusual about it. There are no hallways in this house. You come right in the front door, there's a little entryway, but then obviously to get to any other room, you have to go through some other room. That's not so bad on the first floor, but on the second floor, if you'll look at the image on the right, you have the situation where Emma, to get to her tremendously small bedroom, would have to walk through Lizzie's bedroom. And Andrew and Abby's master suite, such as it is on the rear part of the house. They actually used the servants' stairway, very, very steep staircase, to go up to their bedroom. And any entrance to Lizzie's room had long been blocked off. Everything was locked, so there's no accessing of the two sides of the house. Another odd thing having to do with locks, at some point, everyone in the family, with the exception of Lizzie, started locking their bedroom doors. Even in the daytime when everyone else was home, it would be locked if they were inside it, locked if they were outside it. The keys were quite visible. They put them on the kitchen shelf, but they were locked. And to me, and I think to a lot of other scholars and historians of what happened at Fall River, this very suggestive of something odd, something off and strange about this family. There's a lot of speculation that Lizzie had a little bit of a problem with taking things, shall we say. There are reports of Andrew having to pay off some local shopkeepers for items that Lizzie had taken. It's somewhat coded language. And, we always have to think, is this just rumor that's being spread in the aftermath of the murders? We don't know for sure, but everyone agrees that this house was locked down day and night. Andrew Borden also had multiple locks on the doors leading to the outside, 3, sometimes 4 locks on every door. And he was so insistent on these locks that even their maid, Bridget Sullivan, if she went out to hang up laundry, she was told to lock the door after her, even if she was right there. So there was a bit of paranoia, perhaps, going on. They lived on a busy street, but it still seems excessive. So it was in this strange, rather claustrophobic, locked up house that something terrible happened. And in part, it was because of the house and the layout and the way it was always locked that was part of the sensation for what happened next. This brings us to the morning of August 4th, 1892. That morning, there were 5 people in the house. There was Lizzie, Andrew and Abby Borden, their maid, Bridget Sullivan, and one of Lizzie's uncle who was visiting from out of town. Emma was away in another town visiting relatives. Everyone except Lizzie gathered for breakfast that morning, and most of them were feeling pretty sick. It may be that they were sick because they were on day 3 of some leftover mutton. They had mutton soup for breakfast that morning. It had been incredibly hot. This is an era before refrigeration. And so there was a fair likelihood that there were some cases of food poisoning going on. At around 9 a.m., Andrew left with the uncle to go to the downtown area of Fall River. Abby Borden went upstairs to tidy up the guest bedroom, and Bridget, even with her sickness and the high heat already starting that day, went outside to wash windows. As for Lizzie, well, we don't actually really have a clear picture of what she did at that time. Her story shifted. She was home, we know that much, but where exactly she was at what particular time of the morning is a little unclear. At any rate, around 10:30, Bridget had come back inside and she heard Mr. Borden fumbling with the locks at the front door. She also heard Lizzie on the staircase behind her, and Lizzie was laughing. So Bridget lets Mr. Borden into the house. A little bit later, she hears Lizzie talking with her father, and she tells Mr. Borden that Abby had received a note from a friend saying that the friend was sick. Could she come help? So Abby, she says, isn't home. At that point, Bridget decides to go up to her attic bedroom and try to sleep off that mutton. Shortly after that, around 11 o'clock, Bridget says she heard Lizzie calling from downstairs. And she yells up to Bridget, "Come quick, father's dead." Somebody came in and killed him. Bridget races downstairs, and this is what she finds in the sitting room. Andrew is lying on the sofa, horribly mutilated. His face had been hit a number of times, it turns out 11 times, with a hatchet, the police later determined. It's a terrible crime that happened in a lock house, middle of the morning. Nobody knows where Abby is still. And at some point, Bridget and a neighbor go up the front stairs. And as they're going up, they look to the left, across the landing, through the door of the guest bedroom. The guest bedroom door is open, and they can see under the bed that Abby Borden is lying on the ground. She too has been killed, struck in the back of the head, it turns out 20 times. It's brutal, it's vicious, it's excessive. Lizzie is handling this all rather calmly. She's unemotional. She's not acting in the way police would expect someone whose parents had been killed to act, and especially a woman. Their expectation is that she would be emotional, she would be overwrought. She's not giving them that. They don't arrest her, they continue their investigation. The next day, a friend comes over and sees Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove. Lizzie tells her, no, this is not a big deal. This dress had paint on it and it's useless. So I'm going to be, burning it. Well, the inquest happens within a couple of days of that, and it's a pretty disastrous experience for Lizzie. We do know that she was given a shot of morphine, but even so, her answers are strange. Her story keeps changing. She doesn't do herself any favors, but she's acting, of course, very calm, very pulled together. And that too doesn't sit right with the police. They arrest her. She's sent to jail for nearly a year. And in June 1693, she's finally put on trial for these murders. It is the trial of the century. You've got mobs of people wanting to get into the courtroom. Reporters from every paper that has the ability to send a reporter, they're all there. The trial takes place in New Bedford, Massachusetts, close to Fall River, and they have to run extra telegraph lines to accommodate the number of reporters who are there to send the stories back on the wires. You've also got reporters from abroad who come to cover the case and craft the story of Lizzie Borden and try to unravel the mystery that everyone is holding on to. What happened? Did she do it? And if so, why? Lizzie all this time hasn't spoken to anyone about the trial, about the murders. She's remained silent. She's refused all efforts from reporters to try to interview her. She is just an enigma. The trial goes on for 3 weeks. And when the verdict comes back, it is not guilty. Lizzie Borden is acquitted of murder. It takes the jury less than an hour. Despite their suspicions and all the circumstantial evidence, the fact that this happened in a locked house and the only other person who's not dead, Bridget, has an alibi, they cannot pin this crime on Lizzie. There's also the suggestion, though, that in the minds of a lot of scholars, the suggestion that the jury members, all men, of course, couldn't come to the thought, just couldn't even fathom that a genteel woman, a woman of Borden's social class, could possibly have committed such a heinous crime. That was too uncomfortable of an idea for them to grapple with. So when the verdict comes back not guilty, a lot of people are thrilled. A lot of people had thought that a lady like this simply couldn't have done such a thing. It had to be somebody else, anyone else, who knows who, but it couldn't have been Lizzie. Well, Lizzie and her sister inherit their father's fortune. It's the equivalent of about $8 million today. No small change. And finally, they are able to move to the more fashionable part of town. This is a picture of the house into which they move. Lizzie named it Maplecroft. And Maplecroft was put up for sale a few years ago, so everyone got to see some wonderful photos of the inside of this house. Unlike her previous house, plenty of hallways in this house, I assure you. It's just a grand Victorian home, and the owners of that house really did a nice job of keeping it in the style of the of the 1890s. It's a beautiful home. Lizzie and her sister go on and try to get on with their lives. The problem is the rest of the nation wasn't ready to get on with their lives. Despite some initial community support, it does not take long for the rest of Fall River, and then slowly but surely the rest of most of America, to become convinced that Lizzie Borden actually did kill her father and her stepmother. It doesn't take long, in fact, for a little skipping rope rhyme to start being heard. I'm sure you've heard it before. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Not an accurate rhyme in terms of the murder instrument or the number of blows, but it nevertheless represents the spirit of how people viewed Lizzie Borden. And once again, Borden didn't really do herself any favors. She continued to be stoic in terms of what had happened. She refused to grant interviews, and she started to ostracize people. She, of course, inherited all of her father's property, and she was a tough manager. She didn't give people leeway. Her tenants didn't like her, and she didn't really care. She lost all sorts of social networks that she might have had before. Her church didn't want anything to do with her. And eventually, even Emma left the house and moved elsewhere. In part, perhaps because Lizzie hosted large, lavish parties, uh, especially in honor of a Boston actress named Nance O'Neill. So, what interests me as an English professor is how the burning questions about what actually happened, and even more importantly, about who Lizzie Borden was and why she, most likely, committed these murders. That's a story that we haven't been able to get past. Right from the get go, journalists were framing the first narrative about who Lizzie was in an attempt to answer such questions. And that kind of journalistic framing gave way almost immediately to fictional framings of Lizzie, fiction written about the case or closely inspired by the case. And those constructions of Lizzie Borden continue to this day. So I want to look briefly here at a couple of examples of some of that journalistic framing of Lizzie Borden as produced in the courtroom by one reporter. And then we'll talk a bit about how subsequent audiences, how subsequent artists and writers and creators continue to explore this question of who was Lizzie Borden, what happened, and most importantly, why. Now, in the journalist that I'm going to be talking about today, this journalist constructed a story of Lizzie Borden that really looked at her as a particular kind of woman, a spinster, using the language of the time, an old maid, again, all of 32 years old, and even more specifically, a New England old maid, a Massachusetts maid. So the trial coverage typically follows a certain pattern, regardless of the kind of newspaper you're looking at. Reporters would give over most of the story, and sometimes, again, we're covering the whole front page with coverage of this trial. Most of it would be word for word transcript of what was said. They don't summarize it, they just provide the whole transcript of what had happened. But interspersed around that transcript of the day, each day the journalist would say something about other people in the courtroom, or they would write about the jury members, or they would, most importantly, describe what Lizzie is wearing, what her demeanor is, try to set the scene for how the day is going. And the reporter that I'm going to be looking at with you here for a few minutes does this in some really fascinating ways. This is Julian Ralph. He was a reporter for the New York Sun. This was one of the major newspapers in New York at that time. And like other papers, the New York papers had sent their best reporters to cover this. I've also looked at a reporter for the New York World, a woman who reports on the story, and she too does some fascinating framing of the Lizzie Borden case. So, one of the things that attracted Ralph's attention was a group of women who, unlike a lot of others, were convinced of Borden's guilt and who were the first in line every day waiting to get into that courthouse. This is what Ralph says about those women. There's nothing half so surprising as there is about a certain double row of ladies who come every day and study Borden. These women are more refined looking, more gentle and sweet of face than the prisoner, and yet they are cruel and come to gloat over the lone old maid. They look sweet and fair, but when anyone speaks to them of the trial, they say, "Oh, I do hope they will hang her." Ralph is kind of appalled by this. And even though he's trying to maintain the veneer of objectivity, a word that really wasn't applicable in the standards, the press standards of the time, um, he nevertheless, in his writing, sort of takes up the mantle for protecting Lizzie Borden, or perhaps more specifically, for framing her in a way that goes beyond the obvious assumption of her guilt. In particular, Ralph draws on the convenient fact that he's in Massachusetts and it is the 200th anniversary of the Salem witch trials. So he creates this whole secondary story of Salem as a context for thinking about Borden's position within this trial. Here's an example. He says that this mob of women display an old Puritan spirit which would still burn witches if it dared. Now, Ralph's not the greatest historian here. The witches of Salem were hung, but his point is taken. After Lizzie Borden is acquitted, here's another example of how he's doing this. It took only an hour for the jury to decide that witches are out of fashion in Massachusetts and that no one is going to be executed there on suspicion. Now, these are just a couple of examples, but if you look through all 3 weeks of the trial coverage that Ralph produces, you see him do this over and over. He refers to well-known historical figures from Salem and equates them to the DA and others. And as you're reading, the story becomes not just a story of Lizzie Borden, but a story about Ralph defending women like Lizzie, who are outcast from their society, who are in particular unmarried women, who are seen as perhaps suspect in some way. Ralph, of course, that's one technique. Other journalists try different methods for digging into the character of Lizzie Borden. What's interesting about Ralph's is how it's speaking to emerging anxieties about unwed women, about spinsters that had been developing and were really coming into stronger articulation at the end of the 19th century. So, for much of the 19th century, unmarried women were seen as objects to pity, shall we say. Isn't it unfortunate that unmarried women will not have the opportunity to do the things that they are meant to do, have children and homes of their own? Within the narrow confines of gender ideology of the time, the concept that women might actually choose to be unmarried, that just really wasn't something that people would think about in a positive way. There was kind of an acknowledgement that sometimes women were attracted to each other and would choose to live with each other but polite society did not talk about those kinds of relationships until the last decades of the 19th century. And that's when some medical professionals and others did start to talk about this kind of aberrant woman. And what you see is a development of a lot more suspicion about unmarried women, a movement from seeing them as objects of pity to thinking about the possibility that there might be a sexual element, a homosexual element, and then a jump very, very quickly to the idea that these kinds of women were odd, they were dangerous, they were potentially even violent. Before this period, women's violence was associated almost entirely with lower class women and with women of color. It is the addition of discussions about women's sexual, quote unquote, deviance that it opens the door to the possibility of seeing genteel spinsters as potential murderers. So here's an example of some views of spinsters. The first one's it's negative, but it doesn't talk about violence. So this is from a 1905 short story in which the character says, "Those funny old spinsters always look the same and always ridiculous. Dry twigs, one size all the way down. Very little hair, no emotions. If it weren't for the sake of cats, one would wonder why such people are born." And I could say something about stereotypes of childless cat women still persisting to this day, but I won't say anything about that. The next two quotes, though, are a little bit more indicative of where thinking was. These two are actually from medical textbooks. The middle quote there, then: "The old maid is the pest and scourge of the circle in which she moves, and in extreme cases, she is little less than a she-fiend." Here's another one: "Throughout the civilized world, there are everywhere 3 to 4 single to 1 married woman in the establishments for the insane." Clearly, these women are being seen as incapable of being full women, indeed capable of being fiends and of doing fiendish things. Those are some of the stories that journalists constructed of Lizzie Borden. But it only opened the floodgate to countless other narrative constructions of Lizzie Borden. We have, I don't even remember how many novels, short stories, poems, plays about Lizzie Borden. A few here. Lizzie Borden, Zombie Hunter. I've not read that one. It sounds a bit extreme, perhaps. The one on the left side of the screen posits that Lizzie is mentally aberrant right from the start, but what pushes her over is when her father beheads her pet pigeons, and she does the deed. The middle one is a little bit more lighthearted. This is a whole series of books about Lizzie Borden, child detective, and it talks about how Lizzie gets in trouble for stealing things from stores, but then joins forces with detectives and helps them solve crimes. You also have Lizzie Borden appear as well in TV shows and in movies. Bottom right here, we have Elizabeth Montgomery of Bewitched fame in I think it was 1975 movie that says Lizzie took her clothes off and committed the murders. That's why no blood could be found on her. And I think in that film, there's the suggestion that Andrew Borden has been sexually assaulting his daughter. Upper right, one of the TV series, Lizzie Borden Chronicles, that just leans into Lizzie as psychopath um, content not just to murder her mother and stepmother, but a whole bunch of other people as well. Simpsons has it. Here's a still from the rock opera version of Lizzie. So the question becomes, why do people still keep writing these fictions? Why is it that a case like this has continued to generate such interest, such artistic interest, such desire to know, to try to solve the riddle of what happened and why? That's a big question that I touched on at several points in my academic career and hope to go further with someday. And it's a point that I would love to discuss with you now if you have questions. Thank you.
I do kind of have a thought, I suppose. Um, when it comes to history, this whenever it comes to fascination with particular historical figures, I do think that at least part of it, for some degree, is almost reclamation when it comes to what happened in her case. So we can't go back and change it now, and we can't go back and make people less sexist about spinsters or unmarried women or whatever, but we can write this almost revisionist history about the idea of an abuse victim getting revenge and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And I would say that most of the Lizzie Borden literature that I've read really does attempt to read her in feminist terms and try to, think of her as taking whatever kind of power she could. Lots of them do discuss or envision Lizzie as someone who is the victim of her father sexually. And so it does become a moment to recraft the story, to shift it away from the possibility of, Lizzie being aberrant in some way, uh, to Lizzie as claiming some sort of agency within a terrible situation. So that's a good observation.
I think you touched on this just a little bit, but what piqued your personal interest in researching this topic and even writing a book on it?
Yeah, somehow I have become known as a person who's interested in axe murder, and people will always send me, if they see a Lizzie Borden meme, I'm the one who gets it. Karen, I thought of you. I'm not sure that's a good thing. But, I had known about Lizzie Borden when I was growing up. One of my housemates in college let us know that Lizzie Borden was in her family tree, not directly, but, another branch. And that was great information to have as we went to bed at night. But thinking about Lizzie Borden in an academic sense came out of a class I took during my graduate studies. It was a class on literary journalism. And literary journalism is, journalism that borrows some of the tools that we think of being associated with fiction. So strong narration, character development, plot development, those types of writing tools. In the late 19th century, I found through my research, journalists weren't bound by the same sorts of audience standards and expectations as they came to be in the 20th century. And so I was looking at how journalists were writing about things like crime. I ran across the author Julian Ralph, actually, and had read that he covered the Lizzie Borden trial. That piqued my interest, and that ultimately became a chapter in my dissertation and first book. And Borden has sort of popped up several times as I've continued to work with periodical studies and look at how writers frame things like crime or other issues. So it's just sort of a gift that keeps giving. The fascinating thing about Lizzie Borden is I think she obviously was a real person. She had real victims. But a figure like her in some sense, ceases to be a real person. She becomes, in a way, almost this empty vessel into which authors and others can sort of put whatever they want or need in that vessel. She can be whatever someone wants or needs her to be. And I think that's why people still keep coming back to Lizzie and imagining her in so many different ways over time.
When you say that, it brings to mind like modern day true crime and like the idea of like this kind of passive armchair obsession with murders and horrible things, and just this kind of like voyeuristic look at other people's misery and uh, playing detective with stories in the past and trying to like grapple with like what the real truth is, and it just kind of taking on like a life of its own. And that's not a new phenomenon, of course. Like it bleeds, it leads was a motto for ages. But do you have any thoughts on like that angle of it, like just this persistent, I don't want to say purient interest, but like just fascination, and kind of the leaps people take with that?
Yeah, I think that, in a lot of ways, that connection between our current kind of fascination with true crime, that's something that goes back so far. I tell my students that, even the Puritans, if you look at the kinds of religious pamphlets that Puritans bought more than others, they were the ones that were execution sermons, like sermons that a minister might deliver, to the community before someone in the community was executed for a crime. Why were they interested in that kind of sermon over others? Well, because it would inevitably detail elements of the crime. The earliest newspapers come out of a tradition of ballads being sold on the streets, ballads about crime, about horrible murders. People have always been fascinated with those types of stories. And the reasons for why we are, that's psychologically complex. And I don't think I can fully answer why are we so fascinated with true crime. Some people say it's almost like a psychological escape valve. Like we can look at this horrible thing, we can let our minds sort of grapple with it, and then we can set it aside and come back to proper, normal, everyday life. Edgar Allan Poe, though, had a different way of thinking about this fascination we have with horrible, horrible things. So in his short story, The Black Cat, he writes about this spirit of perverseness that overcomes the narrator of that story. The narrator commits a horrible crime, and he's sort of saying, okay, you reader, you think you're so different from me, but think about it. All of us have this spirit of perverseness where we're led to do horrible things precisely because we know we're not allowed to do them. There's something in us that makes us want to do those things. Now, I'm not sure I would go that far, but maybe psychologically, there's still an element of that here, precisely because we are not in real life going to do those terrible things. Our brains still, in some way, want to know about them. Is it voyeuristic? Yeah, to some degree it is. Is it problematic? Arguably even unethical? Perhaps so. But it's just a fascinating thing that we've seen really for hundreds of years, that kind of interest in reading about true crime.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
I don't want to say I have a comment because it's not even a comment. I don't know if it's a question, but I was really struck by a few different threads that I was hearing about, you had that weird quote from apparently a medical book about
there are more spinsters in asylums than there are married women. Then you talked about how sometimes people, call her a psychopath, call Lizzie a psychopath, and all of these things. And I was wondering if disability studies and or madness studies have looked at her, and if there's like a change from like the focus on her gender to a focus on her madness over time, or if that's just like always been wrapped up in it.
That's interesting. I don't know. That's the answer. I would love to look at that. The psychology part of it that I have seen often involves the suggestion that she might have been abused sexually and that's the trigger. But there too, that's kind of wrapped up with gender as well, right? So I'd be interested to see. Some of the novels is interesting. Out and out say, yeah, she was crazy, and that's why she did it. Others, I think the tendency, though, is to try to mitigate that with, well, she had a reason, and it would be fascinating to look at how this depiction occurs over time in both fiction, but then also nonfiction, accounts of what happened. There are a large number especially the nonfiction one, people trying to say, well, no, she didn't do it. She couldn't have done it. Have you looked at this theory or that theory? And I think it's just the continued mystery and inability to answer that question that drives people to want to do that. So you've given me a good idea for something I want to look at.
I can't wait to hear what you find.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Dr. Roggenkamp. So I had another weird trail off, kind of similar to Becca's, but looking at it from a different perspective. So if I remember correctly, around about especially the 1890s, you start seeing really women trying to do more in the public sphere. You see women who are becoming more independent. They're joining the workforce outside of kind of like big factories and stuff. And I think it's interesting how during the trial, people kind of supported her. But then afterwards, when she kind of takes her role as an independent woman and she starts spending this money and she kind of takes ownership of her life, it's almost as if the press attention turns negative. Not that it wasn't around the time of the trial, too, because you had, I think, all kinds of coverage. But it was like this almost complete turning on her, so to speak. Almost like, how dare you celebrate or live your life, even though we said you were not guilty, when you should be cowed and hiding at home. I just always thought that was kind of interesting about the Borden case.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. It's in the 1890s and around that time that you have the emergence of what comes to be called the new woman. So femininity, proper womanhood had been defined as true womanhood for much of the 19th century. And that was a decidedly home-focused domestic ideal. Women started to have more opportunities. And as the century came to a close, they were much more vocal about what they wanted. No, I don't want to marry. Yes, I want to have a career. If I don't want my career to have to be school teaching, I want to be able to be a reporter, for instance, and report not just on social stuff or children, but on crime. And that was seen as very threatening to a lot of people, men and women in America. Some of those scientific studies that I have looked at that talk about, emerging anxieties about women's same-sex relationships, they say, oh, look, we have so many more of these now. Why do we have these? It's like a virus being spread, and it has everything to do with women seeking more independence and wanting jobs and asking for freedoms. Yes, Nellie Bly is a perfect example of, a new woman. And so it's a contested space. And unfortunately, it sort of gets grafted or perhaps rightfully so. It gets grafted onto Lizzie Borden and sort of after the fact. Well, I do thank you. I don't see any other questions. I'm trying to see if there are any raised hands or anything. But I very much appreciate your coming to this little talk. I would love to talk more about your ideas. And if you ever run across a Lizzie Borden reference in something you're reading, some piece of fiction you're reading, or other cultural context, please do let me know. I would love someday to be able to write a book about Lizzie Borden in popular culture, and I've spent years collecting references, but they keep coming. So maybe by the time I get to write that book, I'll have every single one.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Roggenkamp, and thank you everyone for being here.
Have a great night, everyone.